Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for Harnessing Allyship and Leadership, a panel discussion in recognition of Black History Month. This event has been organized by the Newmarket Public Library in collaboration with the Newmarket African Caribbean Canadian Association. Before the session begins, I would like to explain a few things related to the video technology we're using tonight. So you are in webinar format, meaning that only the presenters can be seen and heard. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to the panel, please click on the chat icon located at the bottom center of your screen. The questions you post in the chat box will be answered at the end of the discussion after all panelists have had the opportunity to speak. Also, make sure your screen is set to gallery view, as there are periods in the presentation where more than one panelist will need to be seen at one time. If you look at the top right corner of your screen and you see an icon called View, you can click on that and set it to gallery view. If you don't see an icon up there, then you should be all right and you should already be in gallery view. And lastly, tonight's session will be recorded. And with that, I'll pass it over to Teresa from NACO.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex, for that. And I just wanted to start off with a special welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, members of our NACA community in Newmarket, as well as those joining us from beyond Newmarket, and all of our allies as well that are on this call or in this village this evening. I'd like to also say a special welcome to our Mayor John Taylor and Deputy Mayor Tom Vague, as well as members of council. And they are Bob Quapis is here, Christina Bisans, Kelly Broom, Victor Woodhouse, Trevor Marson, Ray Simon, as well. We have representation from MP Van Bynen's office. Sarah Campbell is here. Also Don Gallagher Murphy from MPP Elliott's office. Welcome also to Superintendent Ryan Hogan and Deputy Chief Brian Bigras. Welcome. So we have a full house, and at this time, I would like to call on Pauline to present our land acknowledgement, along with Kim Wheatley with the smudging for tonight.
Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that we convene this meeting upon the treaty lands of the First Nations of the Williams Treaty and the Chippewa of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest community. We also acknowledge that we are all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as immigrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We must also recognize the fact that this colonial nation is founded in historic and ongoing dispossession of this land's indigenous peoples. Today, we especially pay tribute to the ancestors of those of African and indigenous origin and descent. As an organization that centers on social justice, we feel it is critical to be informed on the past and the ongoing consequences of colonialism. We encourage everyone to learn about the history of these lands and to support resistance here and across Turtle Island. I give thanks for the land that nourishes us and enables us to live in communities. May we continue to aspire to nurture and care for this land and for each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pauline, for guiding us through that land acknowledgement, and Kim Wheatley for grounding us in this with the smudging ceremony. At this time, I would like to call on our mayor, Mayor John Taylor, Town of Newmarket, to provide some remarks.
Thanks very much, Teresa. It's really great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and the dialogue and the opportunity to learn. You know, the panel is discussing harnessing allyship and leadership, and I think that you know, I just wanted to maybe share a few personal comments about what I think that means for me and what it means for the community, I guess, in some ways as well. But for myself, as I know Kim knows and Teresa knows, I spent some time many years ago working in Indigenous communities and with Indigenous communities as a teacher, and during that time, I you know, to be an ally, and which is what I was striving to be, but it was a journey of becoming. It wasn't something you were; it was something you were becoming. But it required me to really first to learn a lot. And I think that's what Black History Month represents, is an opportunity to learn a lot. And I think, you know, for myself, you know, now in this journey that in the last couple of few years, led by NACA, about, again, trying to become and be an ally to the Black community, I think it has to be grounded in learning. And for myself, the way to do that is through humility, through, I think, through open-mindedness. And I think the other part is through determination, because I think we know that the Black community and many of the people I'm going to, you know, I've listened to and heard speak have great determination, but they need allies who are determined too. We can't come to this as a casual hobby or something we do on the side of our desks. We need to be dedicated and committed and determined, just as the Black community is and the leadership in the Black community is. And the humility, I think, is also understanding power and in how it involves relationships. And so as a teacher, a white teacher coming to an Indigenous community, I had to understand that and check it quite a bit, because it could easily prevent you from being open-minded and being humble and learning. And I think that challenge has, if anything, grown a little bit, because now I come to the relationship with the Black community as an ally in the position of mayor and a white male, and that's even more to check, a little more challenging to check some of that stuff, but it's important to do so. And so I think it's incredibly important. But I want to point out, though, that the theme of the panel is actually harnessing allyship and leadership. And I said this a little while ago. I have to say to NACA and Teresa and the other executive members and the membership, that is exactly what they've been doing. I won't pretend for a second that that myself as mayor or council, that we sort of stood up and said, we need to do something here. Let's start learning and let's start moving forward and let's start taking some action. The truth is, NACA and Teresa came and got us and harnessed us and brought us along. And so really, the watching NACA over the last number of years in our community has been an exercise in watching the harnessing of allyship and leadership through determination, but also through you know, open-mindedness and partnership, and willing to take the time to bring us along and educate us. And so I look at tonight as another opportunity to do that. I want you to know that the council at the town of Newmarket, myself as mayor, is deeply committed to this process and to the journey and to learning and to doing that from a place of humility and open-mindedness and determination as allies, standing alongside and taking the lead from NACA and the Black community. And I look forward to hearing the panel tonight and learning as much as I possibly can. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you, Mayor John Taylor. I wasn't expecting a sermon tonight. You preached. Thank you so much. Thank you for your allyship and leadership, and for always speaking and being authentic and staying true. And it is my pleasure at this time to introduce our gorgeous moderator for tonight, Miss Kim Wheatley. Traditional Anishinaabe grandmother, Kim Wheatley carries Ojibwe, Patawa, I'm going to stumble on this word, Kim, Patawaomi, and Black ancestry. She is band member of Shawanga First Nation and Turtle Clan. Her work revolves around cultural consultation, ceremonies, teachings, and event development. As a multi-award winning, why can't I read tonight? What's going on? So I'll start again. As a multi-award winning speaker, Kim has presented locally, nationally, and internationally. With her diverse background, Kim continues to serve by walking the road of reconciliation. It's my honor to present to you your moderator for tonight, Ms. Kim Wheatley. Take it over, Kim. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry, Kim, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The button sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't, but 2 times a charm, is that what they say? Anine Bojo, thank you so much, Teresa, for that beautiful introduction and welcome. I'm so excited about tonight, and I'm looking forward to having a very meaningful dialogue. So I want to say greetings and welcome to the Black History Month discussion. And as you've heard, it's focusing on harnessing allyship and partnerships. I'm your moderator, and I'm looking forward to having this opportunity to engage with 3 remarkable speakers. And I too thank the Chippewas of Georgina Island. That is Treaty 13 territory. And for those of you who don't know about territories, it's really easy to Google. whoselandamion.ca is a really great site to go to. And in this talk here, I want to, insert a bit of myself and perhaps some of my questions, but I'm certainly looking forward to community questions at the end of this dialogue. And so I just want to add a little bit more about who I am. I identify as Ojibwe and Potawatomi, and I have some Caribbean ancestry as well. This is newly discovered in my life, so I'm just figuring out how to introduce myself in that way. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm a mother of 3 mixed ancestry daughters. And it's my honor to guide us through an exploration of identity, racial and social injustice, and finding ways to harness allyship and leadership possibilities that we could all utilize within our own circles. So I believe we have to become action-oriented, and this needs to happen in our minds and in our hearts, but also in our choices by teaching our children and families to invest in this work, but also to extend our relationship outwards for those who have like-minded views. And this is a way to grow, I think, true allyship in lots of different ways and in healthy, sustainable ways. And leadership also with this outside of our comfort circles. Sometimes we only stick to the people we feel comfortable with, but we have great allies in people that maybe we're not so comfortable with, but who have the ability to extend our reach. So that all said, I do believe all of this is possible, and I want to get right into introducing our esteemed panelists. And maybe they can guide us on the how and ways to look at this from different perspectives. So I'd like to introduce the first panelist, which is Molly Coles-Hunn. Molly is a mother, writer, poet, and community organizer living in Newmarket, Ontario, and she has a BA from York University. She's majored in social science with a stream in social justice studies. She has over 20 years experience working with the nonprofit sector and continues to study anti-oppressive practice and allyship through personal reflection, community engagement, and supportive mentors. She is the co-creator of the SoCo Collective, a local grassroots organization that seeks to facilitate community learning and inspire active connection with important social movements. She is also a certified forest therapy guide. Our next guest will be Melissa McCletchie, and she's a 3rd-year PhD candidate of Caribbean descent in the Department of Sociology at York University. She grew up in the city of Scarborough, so did I, in Toronto, Ontario, and she uses her experiences of supporting her imprisoned loved ones to guide her academic research. Her work examines the collateral consequences of imprisonment and the Canadian criminal punishment system, particularly the impact of incarceration on the families of Black Canadian prisoners. Welcome. And our third panelist is Beatrice Anane Vidalco. And I apologize if I butchered your name. I did try to do my best. She's a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology at York University, and she holds a Master's of Education in Humanities, Social Science, and Social Justice Education from the University of Toronto, OISE, and earned her honors of Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Wilfrid Laurier University. Beatrice's work, her academic work, is motivated by an unwavering commitment to the collective struggle for Black freedoms and life forms. Her interests include race and racialization. My tongue's starting to behave like yours, Teresa. Black geographics and the spatialization of race. Grounded in her lived experiences, her dissertation explores how Black people respond to violent forms of spatialized organization and racialization, shaping Black people's patterns of residential mobility and non-mobility, to move out or stay put involuntarily or voluntarily. She intends to carve out spaces for Black folks to make sense of their own experiences of geographic expulsion, serving as a catalyst in reimagining and reconstructing landscapes that move beyond Euro-white geographies. Beyond her academic work, she is intimately invested in the Black community, where, in partnership with Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Peel and the Black Community Advisory Council, she participates as a Big Sister mentor alongside, offering affordable, individualized tutoring services to low-income families in both Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. Please join me in welcoming all of these beautiful panelists that we have here this evening. Now we're going to launch right into some questions, and I want to start it off with a bit of a comment to prompt the three panelists into, warming up your brain and getting ready to churn out some answers. We're hearing the words dismantling anti-Black racism, and I think a lot of people are unsure what that means. But do we actually know what that is? It's a framework of words kind of linked together, but I'm not sure that everybody understands what that is. To dismantle something means to take apart, in my understanding. Blackness has many facets, and not everyone with melanin identifies with this word. Racism comes in many forms, and attached to the word anti-Black seems to make it somewhat identifiable in focus. But what is anti-Black racism? I believe that we need to have dialogue about what this is. So I think the first question I'll ask each of the panelists to weigh in on is, what is allyship? Maybe let's start there so that we could understand and kind of work our way towards what anti-Black racism might be. So would anybody like to start first? Beatrice, can I call on you perhaps?
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I'm just under the weather, so if my voice cracks, it's because I'm going through it. Let me know if I have any difficulties or you're having troubles hearing me. So the term allyship, for me, kind of has been a point of contention. And that's because of the ways that it's been weaponized against Black bodies and Black people, how it's been used as a stepping stool for self-gratification and so forth. So in my experience, it's been deployed to kind of pacify the needs of non-white folks in hopes of quelling or rectifying white guilt. So I take allyship and notions around allyship quite seriously, because I think that it requires a lifelong commitment. And for many, the act of allyship is fleeting. So given this context, for me, I believe that allyship is a verb, right? So it requires actions from those who are intentional about supporting a cause, a group of people, and so forth. It's also a transfer of privilege for me. So in any capacity, whatever privilege you have, it's transferring that to a cause or a said group of people and so forth. And in other words, I think that allyship is an embodiment of putting your mouth where your power is, right? So being an ally is hard work. It's a process of loss, but I think it's also a process of recovery. So when I think of what it means to be an ally in the context of Black life, it's to support and validate in allowing Black folks to take back their power in their communities, whether you completely understand where they're coming from or not. It's about engaging in continual self-reflection, or to uncover socialized privileged or internalized superiority. I think that it's about recognizing our complicities in anti-Blackness or varying intersections of oppression and taking responsibility of our mistakes. It's advocating for Black life and our freedoms in the absence of Black folks, right? So challenging dominant misconceptions. And then generally speaking, when I think of allyship, it's about helping to chip away at these big, daunting structures that make life freer and more possible for us all. So that's my tidbit on that.
Wow, that was deep, complex, and definitely thought-provoking. Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in and offer a comment? Molly? You're on mute, so just unmute, please. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No, it's important to prompt me. Yeah, that is definitely a powerful definition. And when I think about allyship, I think very much about how it's a dynamic and ongoing process. And I love when you said about putting your mouth where your power is. I think that's how you said it. And that, and it being an embodiment, and that being a practice. And to me, that has internal and external. There's this quote I just read about Martin Luther King was saying about how these transformations we need, they will have qualitative and quantitative changes from us as individuals. And I believe that it makes sense for society. And so we need to do the internal work. And speaking as a representing as a white woman, how do we work with our privilege, deconstruct, make mistakes and come back from them and repair, instead of being too afraid or of needing to be perfect, and so not so shutting down. And to me, that's part of the dynamicism, is to really keep re-entering in relationship with the movement, and continually acting from the places that I am or allies are changing within themselves internally, and that's ongoing. And I think the dismantling happens in both of those realms. Dismantling white supremacy, to name it, and the other things that come from colonialism sort of ideology, and how do we decolonize in those ways, in the things that we've internalized and outwardly, and then how do we future build together in solidarity with those communities that have been marginalized or underserved.
Thank you so much. I love the words decolonize and dismantling. I think that's really important kind of juice to hold in the brain in terms of examining what your actions are and what you're actually aligning to. Melissa, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, it was said so well by Beatrice. You know, I think especially in the era that we're in with social media, a lot of people think that allyship is like a black box to support BLM, or an orange square to support, the indigenous community, but it's so much more than that, right? And it really is, continuous action towards dismantling systemic oppression, to supporting marginalized people, to creating space. And those in our community, particularly, white people in the community who want to be allies, really have to go through like a personal reckoning of their own privilege. And I think Mayor Taylor said it really well in the beginning, with his experience. He was talking about going to indigenous communities as a teacher, and like how it changed him internally as a person. And then for him to understand his positionality in not necessarily looking at the historic circumstances, but contemporarily, like how has he benefited from the histories of colonialism and racism and enslavement and all of these things within this country, and then doing something and feeling a personal responsibility to be better and to change the situation and circumstance. I think that is, you know, really what allyship is on a personal level. It's not just with your mouth. You gotta, you know, put some real dedication and action behind what it is that you're saying.
Thank you so much for that. You know, when we look at anti-Black racism, as I was mentioning earlier, some people will say just Black racism. Is there an importance or a significance on the weight of saying anti-Black racism? Anybody? Beatrice, I see that big smile.
I think it's important when we're talking about anti-Black racism or Black racism that we begin by defining what racism is. And I think that grounds our understanding of what Black racism looks like, right? So
So how would you define it?
So there's varying just constructions around what racism looks like, right? Depending on your understanding of racism, that kind of informs what you deem as racist, right? So I think on the basis or the basic understanding of racism, it's an oppression of one racial group that dominates over the other, right? And then in North America, white folks are the dominant group and then non-white people are the minoritized group, right? So racism here looks like white racial cultural prejudice and discrimination that's used to advantage white folks, white communities, and disadvantage non-white folks, right? So when I think about different constructions of racism, on one hand, you have folks who believe that racism is interpersonal, right? It's individualized, right? So racism in this context occurs between individuals, and this is what most people think is racist, right? So racial prejudice. So it's this belief that an individual's racist assumptions, their actions, their attitude, whether it's intentional or not, is what supports or perpetuates racism. And in this case, if you were to rectify racism as individualistic, a solution might look like a change in someone's action, right? And on the other hand, you have folks who understand racism as something as systemic, right? So here racism is premised on, yes, this white racial cultural prejudice and discrimination, but it's supported by institutional powers and authority, right? So in this context, racist practices and policies are entrenched in established institutions that result in exclusion or promotion of designated groups. As such, we have policy that supports or a policy that supports or systematizes or perpetuates unequal distribution of privilege, resources, and power would be seen as something that's racist, right? So for me, personally, I see racism as moving beyond the individual to more of a collective pattern, right? So yes, I think individual intentions matter, but I think what's most significant is how racial prejudice is backed by these institutions that reinforces racism in very particular ways that serves white interests and white power. So even when individuals are not present, right, these adverse conditions because of this system continues to exist, right? So this is why we have health disparities, economic disparities, disparities in terms of incarceration rates, and so forth. Really quickly, so there's a professor who I really admire intellectually, and her name is Christina Dr. Sharp. She's at York right now, and she speaks specifically to this Black racism, right? So in her work, she argues that because of enslavement and the ways that it constructed Black life as non-human in the past, in our contemporary world, these constructions of the past continue to haunt us, right? So our lives are swept up and produced by this afterlife of enslavement. So what she tends to say is that the past is thought to remain in the past, right? But it always reappears to rupture the future, the present, right? So the impact of Black enslavement, it continues to shape our contemporary life today, which is why we continue to see Black subjugation, right? So when the question is asked, what's Black racism? For me, it's about recognizing that there's ongoing criminalization of Black bodies, right? The criminalization of Black languages, of ways of existing. It's experiencing stop and frisk laws, right? Black incarceration rates that boggle the mind. It's about being able to predict Black death when we think about Black folks and cops, right? It's the erasure, even in academic spaces, of like students in education, right? So Black racism is socially constructed. It's these attitudes, these ideas, these practices that are supported by institutional powers that deny Black or African folks their dignity, their opportunities, their freedoms, their rewards. And this is heavily tied to historical accumulations of ongoing violence, right? So anti-Black racism would be in opposition to all these things, if that makes sense.
I think it's a lot to digest, but it's definitely far more complex than initially those words lead you to believe, and diving deep into the understanding of it, and not only attaching your personal, you know, interpretation of that, but to think about it collectively. And I love that you said it's a collective pattern. We need to move beyond the individual and recognize this as a collective pattern, and that it is socially constructed and it's based on denials. I mean, this is a universal truth. I think we can all agree upon, and it seems like this mountain of dismantling that needs to take place in a system that just doesn't seem to want to change. And so, you know, we're left in this position where we're trying to figure out how to navigate anti-Black racism, how to identify it, how to place it or box it in some ways. And I don't think it needs to be boxed. I think it all needs to be interwoven together so we can understand the bigger process and then start addressing the individual approaches that you can take in perhaps collective scenarios and in individual instances. I don't think there's a person of color who has not experienced some sort of you know, very tangible racism and been at a loss in some ways on how to respond to that or react to that. So I thank you for that very deep dive into exploring what that could mean and why that's why it's important to perhaps have that word anti-Black racism on there. You know, when it comes to disrupting injustice and inequalities in a huge realm, or rather it is a huge realm to tackle for the average Black community member. And there are many ways to do this, but what I want to ask the panel as a whole is, in your view, what are some of the best ways to begin this? Because really that's where this conversation is now leading us, right? Is if you're talking about dismantling, like, where do you start? And how do you hold that space? How do you hold the line individually and perhaps collectively? Because oftentimes it's an individual experience. And so now what? Like, what do we do? So Molly, perhaps you'd want to kind of weigh in on that?
Sure. In the question, it sort of highlights that, you know, this would be an overwhelming thing for an individual Black community member. And I immediately feel like, why is that on an individual Black community member? I feel like it's so important that, like Mayor John Taylor was sort of saying, that those in which have more privilege or benefit from white supremacy or other oppression of other communities are dismantling the thing that is oppressive, from which they might be benefiting or are benefiting societally. And so I think that's the first thing, is that it needs to be a collective movement, and there needs to be support alongside that leadership and that harnessing, that we're working together to dismantle and then build together. And it's not on any individual's shoulders, or a community group's like the Black community shoulders to do that work on their own. And so I think a lot about the internal aspects, the ideological change, the revisioning of internalized things, and then how that turns into action. And I think it's really important that those are balanced. And so just things like decolonizing what you read, the entertainment that you take in, you know, who you are seeing on your social media feeds, and all these different ways in which other people's voices and experiences are part of the way that you can see the world. I think it's Lee Markle who said, like, how do I tell that someone yours is not the only narrative? And I'm not quoting that perfectly well, but the idea is that we need to shake this idea of supremacist narrative in order to really be able to, and that's A, and then B, deconstructing how it is that it came to be that there's a thought of having a dominant narrative. And so when that internal work is being done, then where do we start? I think it's really important to have community learning, that there are other people alongside in which you can learn and work through those dismantling of privilege and of complicity, and to talk about, like, how do I continue to engage with this not being performative, but really an ongoing embodiment, as you use that word, of and relationship to how I connect with myself and with the world, with others, and with people experiencing oppression. And so those are really good. And then where do we begin acting? And I think using privilege and power that you have, and the transfer of that, as Beatrice spoke about, you know, finding in your circles the places in which power can be shared or transferred, and also amplifying Black voices in spaces where, well, everywhere, and especially in spaces where you're noticing no representation or token representation in spaces, and asking and pushing for non-token representation in spaces where you're not seeing that. And that also means speaking up on an individual level when things, when something racist, like a policy or a comment, but then pushing the communities that you're in, and the towns, the cities, the municipal, the provinces, the nations that you're in different ways that you can use your voice to be, what are you doing? Proactively asking, what are the ways in which you are tackling anti-Black racism? And if those discussions are, you're just starting them with them and activating those, or continuing to kind of push organizations and municipalities to be moving along as you're moving along. Allyship is sort of this partnering with other allies and partnering with other communities to continue to move together and push that future building further. So those are just some thoughts.
Thank you, Molly. I can tell that you're trying to cover the gamut, and you know, there are three of you here, and many of you have some very unique ideas on how to disrupt injustice and inequalities. And you know, we hear a lot about the transference of power and privilege, but what does that really mean? You know, and how do you transfer that? and with whom? And I think I'm going to direct that question at you, Melissa. You know, when we look at disruption, oftentimes it's seen as confrontational and can result in violence. But how would you approach a disruption of inequalities?
I first want to say that the comment that Beatrice made about, you know, Blackness or moving beyond Blackness as an individual or anti-Blackness as an individual thing and looking at it more as a systemic problem is really at the root of us getting to some sort of solution when it comes to anti-Black racism, right? Like, there are many people who come to North America, come to Canada, who really have no idea that they are Black until they get here, right?
Yeah,
So that's where
true.
we really start to understand that the idea of Blackness is created, right? The idea of being a Black person is something that is created because there are melanated people who look like us in other parts of the world that don't identify with that identity. And so when they do come here, it's almost as if this idea of Blackness is forced on you, because to operate within the system that we have here, you have to adopt this. You cannot be anything else. This is what we are told when we come to North America, to places like Canada. One way that I personally have seen, you know, the notion of Blackness and the identity of Blackness and the negative connotations that come with it being resisted is through groups like the Moorish Science Temple of Canada and of North America. Like, these groups that, you know, originated in the United States in like 1912 and then moved on and now have, you know, sectors in North America and in Canada, they completely reject the notion of being Black because of everything negative that comes with that identity. You know, they prefer to identify nationally, you know, by a national designation as opposed to like by a quote unquote color, right? As what they would say. And the way that they challenge anti-Blackness within Canada is just not even feeding into the idea that they are Black. And I think that is a different way of understanding how it can be challenged, because Blackness is not a homogeneous identity. There are people, like I said, who are not in this country who don't identify as Black, and there are people in this country who don't identify as Black. So I think we have to start maybe bringing people with other types of understandings of what it means to be a, you know, melanated person with African origins, because we tend to kind of stay in this very linear understanding of anti-Black racism or Blackness that everybody is not necessarily fitting into or feeding into anymore. Sorry, you can ask me the question that you asked me originally.
No, I love that we're going down this path, because I don't hear conversations like this where you challenge the, you know, identity is so important, and people should have the right to choose their identity and not be assigned their identity. And there's this judgment based on how you visually present that you are this. And then there's this grouping of people into these large groups that, like you said, may not identify with that whatsoever. And it's not that they're rejecting their skin color, they're embracing their identity. And we need to honor that. And I love the idea of choosing your identity based on your nationality. I mean, when we look at Africa as a whole, people think Africa is a place of great impoverishment for the most part. And, you know, and these people who are like far behind the times, when the complete opposite end of the spectrum is true in the majority of cases. And yet people can't when you look at Africa, if somebody says I'm from Africa, they think of the whole continent, and they don't think about the individual nations that are there
Exactly.
and the unique diversity amongst those nations. You know, as a First Nations person, I get this all the time. You know, somebody meets me, it's like, oh, you're Ojibwe. Hey, I know somebody, and then they give me some name and expect me to know this person.
Right.
Like, you know, we're only 10 people on the whole planet, but it's not true, right? And so I love that you brought that forward. And I think it's a very powerful statement. And
it is. And when you have that, oh, the name of the group, I saw it in the chat. It's the Moorish Science Temple of America.
I was just going to ask that. Like,
but they also
what did you
have
say?
a chapter in Canada, right? And, you know, their whole premise and their whole focus is like, let's get away from holding on to this like very negative identifier that evolved from like the N-word to Negro to colored to now Black. Like, let's just completely stop using that and let's focus on our nationality. And when you have an understanding of your nationality, just like what you're saying with like Africa having so many different regions and, you know, different countries, it's like all of these countries come with their own history beyond enslavement, right? All of these countries now come with their own, you know, stories that they can be proud of, that you now as a melanated person who's not identifying as Black can identify with something that is positive, as opposed to it always being, you're Black, we went through slavery, we were, you know, like, let's talk about the positive things. Let's move on past this. And I think if we can share those histories prior to enslavement, and talk about the nations within the continent of Africa that were really like leaders for the world, right? Then we can start to change what the idea of Black is contemporarily. Because when people hear Black, we're always just talking about enslavement, you know?
Yeah, and it's weaponized, that word as well,
Exactly.
right? And it's put upon you. And I come back to the idea that we live in a democracy where we're supposed to be able to have freedoms to choose, especially things like your identity.
Yep.
And the laws do not allow that equally.
Yes.
And so this is part of, colonial rule, because it was made for people who were not melanated. And so, we're seeing the long-term impacts of just that constant regurgitation. And then it's almost like it's in people's genes. Like, well, you look Black, you must be Black.
Right.
And they tell you what you are. And when you push back, they put you kind of in this defensive mode where you have to give this whole history lesson and you have to explain to them, how and why you identify. And yet when you bounce it back to them, they're just very comfortable in saying, well, I'm this, and I don't want to, say a culture or even a skin color, but, there's this, I guess it's the privilege again, right? It's the privilege of being comfortable and having the right to say, oh, well, this is who I am. But you can't be, because you don't look like that.
Right. It's
and
so
what are we
true.
supposed to look like?
It's so true. I have a friend who is, she's indigenous, but she's a highly melanated, woman. And when she tells people that she's indigenous, it's like, people will not believe her. Like, how can you be, you don't look indigenous, you don't have the two, braids coming down at the side. And she's like, but not all indigenous people look like that. Like, there are so many stereotypes of, what indigeneity is, what Blackness is, that have been perpetuated within our society, that is causing a lot of the problems that we have between people to this day, because not everybody fits very neatly into those boxes. We just don't. And when we start to look at the histories of people, just groups of people and nationalities of people, particularly in North America, you can start to see the connections of like how we got to the place that we are right now. For example, even looking at like South Carolina law, there is a Sundry Free Moors Act. I can't remember the date, but it's called the Sundry Free Moors Act of 1928, or let's say something like that. But when you go and you read it, it actually allowed people, melanated African people who identified as Moors, to be free from enslavement in South Carolina during a time when other groups of people who were melanated were being enslaved. So like when you start to see these things and you start to understand that, you know, people were using designations other than Blackness to even get their freedom before emancipation, like that was eye-opening for me, at least, because these are things that I never knew. So now it makes you wonder, why is it not something that was used by, you know, others, groups of people who were enslaved at the same time? And then now it makes you question me as a person, like, is the story that we've been fed and told about enslavement authentic? Is it actually the way that it went, you know, where all Black people in North America were slaves? And we know that that's not true. So what were the rest of us doing?
Well, this is where history has this big gap, right?
Right.
And our stories were not told by us.
Right.
And we're trying to reclaim that and rewrite history to insert the truth. And even once we get to the truth, there are many truths. So there's great diversity in that truth as well. So what you're touching on here is really, really important. And I think challenging historic amnesia, even though we're living in this time, we have the right to go back in our own lineage, and we have the stories, and we have, you know, the scientific data, and we have, right? And when you pile that all up, how many people are willing to sit and listen and go through the density of what that is? Because it's not simple, it's complex. The story of slavery is simple. And it's not simple. There are lots of complexities, as you clearly highlighted there, that I think are really beautiful. And like you, many of us, you know, are trying to hold one little piece of the puzzle and have a relationship of understanding, and then use that as some sort of a power tool to manifest real momentum moving forward in manifesting real meaningful change for us. I think we cannot put the power into another's hands to ask them to change it for us. We have to make very clear what the changes are that we need, that we want to see, where the, you know, the inequities are clearly demonstrable, and put a lot of pressure into that. And that's, I think, a place where allies can step forward. But, you know, there's a lot of internal racism as well amongst our community members, right? As you highlighted, by those who perhaps have a very highly melanated pigment of skin, and yet do not identify right as the term that you're putting upon them. And I know that it's a really deep pool for us to try and navigate, but I did have some questions for you that maybe we'll kind of swing back to. And so the initial question for you, Melissa, was, in your view, what are some of the best ways to disrupt injustice and inequalities? And certainly, you know, learning the true history and embracing that and disseminating that. I don't think we should all have to be historians, but I think there should be active places where you can go in digestible formats to access that. And, you know, this is one of the beauties, I think, of Black History Month, is we get these, you know, we get these very intimate engagements and opportunities to dialogue about the multifaceted story as a whole, but also actionables and actions. And I love that. So what are some of the best ways, you know, to really disrupt injustice and inequalities in your viewpoint?
It's, you know, it's not enough to have the knowledge, but you have to use the knowledge, right? Like, you really have to challenge the things that you hear people say that are racist against particular groups of people. And, you know, you can't, for me, I find it really difficult to, you know, have the conversation with somebody about why what they're saying is problematic or racist if I don't really have anything to support my opinions with, you know. Especially I find people from older generations, when you're having these conversations, like, you know, you shouldn't say that, or, you know, that's not really appropriate, or something appropriate to say. They've been so accustomed doing these things, and they are so accustomed saying these things, that I don't think it's like a personal, you know, like a personal attack against a group of people. I feel like they've just been doing it for so long, and no one's ever told them that's a problem and you shouldn't say that. You know, for example, I worked in long-term care for many years, and the residents that I would interact with, there were some who were very pleasant, but you know, a lot of the older white residents would say like really racist things to myself, to, you know, the other workers there who were Black, and it would be hurtful. But you also have to like kind of recognize that they are coming from a different period of time. And it's not to say that inside of them, they are like these just evil, horrible people, you know, like I think a lot of them, they really didn't know. Were just not informed. And for the ones who are open to those conversations, you can talk to them and be like, you know what, you don't really say that. You know, this is not an appropriate conversation to have, or you don't talk to people that way. And if they're open, they're able to absorb it and they're able to at least try and put it into practice. For the people who I encounter that are completely not open to even hearing about why their actions or why the things that they're saying are problematic, I am not going to put myself in harm's way to educate them. That's not something that I'm going to do. At the end of the day, I feel like it's all about self-preservation. And if somebody is willing to meet me to have a dialogue, I'm willing to meet them to have a dialogue. But I am not taking it upon my shoulders or my family's shoulders to be the representative for the Black community and to educate, you know, someone who's blatantly racist and doesn't want to change on why their behavior is problematic. I feel like this is particularly the type of, you know, confrontation or injustice where, you know, allies are so valuable and are so important, where they can use the privilege that they have, you know, as a white woman, as a white man, to step in and do something about that confrontation. Because for Black people, as we've seen, it's not safe all the time to confront people on their racism, right? So I feel like this is the prime way that I can think of allies really, like Beatrice said, like putting your, you know, your actions where your words are, to step in and say, hey, that's a problem. And I am not going to allow you to say that around me. I am not going to allow you to do that to this person. Whether you know that Black person, the racialized person or not, it's just saying that I am not condoning it anymore.
You're just opening up a whole can of worms that's beyond the questions I had prepared for you. And, you know, I think that where the dialogue is at right now is where the average person is able to navigate and digest. And these are important dialogues. I don't encounter these on a regular basis in a broad circle. I certainly experience it in my intimate circles. But Beatrice, I could see that you were triggered by some of what she had to say in terms of you know, how to look at this, and the safety issue is a real issue. Like we can't soften that in any way. We are more at risk in this country if we are a visible minority, and I don't know how we get to be a minority when majority of the world population is melanated people. But this is again a terminology that is a lessening of who we are. When you are called a minority, there's this perception that somehow you are less than because there are less of you, or you're a smaller group, but that's not true in this country. And indeed, it's not true around the world. But I'm interested in what, you know, what bounced off of you, Beatrice, based on what Melissa just shared, because these are real basic truths that a lot of people are thinking about and perhaps dialoguing about, and would love to hear your perspectives on.
Yeah. I think a lot of what Melissa was saying was landing with me, and also Molly, because I think that oftentimes as like community members, it's a lot, right? It's really daunting. And I honestly think that the first step when we're trying to disrupt injustice and inequality is starting with the self, right? And I know that prior to us talking about racism as being systemic and so forth, but I also think that in order for us to take steps to change this systemic, that we need to also focus on the micro, right? And a term that came to my mind was internalized oppression. So this is the idea that people internalize or act out, often unintentionally, this constant messaging that you're inferior, that the dominant group is more deserving of, or you're in a lower position. And then adopting these patterns of thinking allows us to continue these patterns of inequality, right? And then some examples of internalized oppression is believing that this dominant group, right, is more qualified, right? Or behaving in ways that doesn't challenge, right, because of safety and so forth, but it also legitimizes their position by not challenging these kinds of things. Silently enduring microaggressions, right? Having low expectations of yourself and others. Believing that these struggles in institutions, so not having access to education, not having access to employment or healthcare, is a result of your own doing or your group's own inadequacies, right? Rather than something that's systemic, right? Or harshly criticizing one another. And then for me, I think it really does start with the self, right? So if I can share a personal story. So as a child, up into my adult life, I carried so much shame around my last name. And like, Kim, when you were mentioning my last name, when you would ask me how to pronounce it, I was grateful for that, because folks don't ever ask me about how do I pronounce my last name. But for a long time, it was always mispronounced, or because of its length and nature, it's been shortened so that it's convenient for other people. So because of that, there was a deep-seated hate, right, for myself and my rootedness. And it made it easier for me to assimilate, right, or want to assimilate to the dominant group, right? So I endured microaggressions, right? I avoided issues or I avoided confrontation in order to minimize myself. And it was actually when I enrolled into the program at OISE, which is the social justice program, was my world shifted, right? And I worked through this process of unlearning and grounding myself and being able to step into my power, right? To disrupt and speak, even in minute forms, because I find that like, it's hard for us, like Melissa said, to like confront these big things, but like in small spaces and injustices in our neighborhoods, in our community, we can do this, right? We can speak up for ourselves. So from this point, I think that when you ground yourself, then you can maybe join a collective, or you could join a community that align with your values to create more of a systemic change. And then I feel like you gain confidence, and then institutional changes can kind of take place. So when I'm thinking of what does this look like, what does disrupting institutional spaces look like, I think it's like little things like paying attention to the dynamics in your workspaces, right? Or facilitating patterns, facilitating interruptions and unsuitable patterns. So for example, in the workplace, offering to facilitate by inviting voices, right? So ask, does anyone have a different perspective, right? Who hasn't spoken yet? Whose perspectives are we missing? And then wait, because in this way you disrupt these unequal balances of power, right? But you also make you carve out spaces for yourself to exist, right? I think it's also important for us to recognize that who in our environment matters, right? The roles that people play in those environments also matter. And if you have enough allies and collective community power, you can work to increase these representations on multiple fronts to support, to create a supportive climate in these spaces. So personally speaking, I'm a PhD candidate, and as one of my roles, or some of the things that I've decided to do, is participate in the admissions committee. And basically we get to decide what students get to be a part of the graduate committee, right? Or get to come to the graduate program at York University. So here, what I try to do is use the little power I do have to influence who gains entrance into York's program. And I have the ability to advocate, right, for the increase of representations. And I really try to do this in a real, tangible way, even though it's not like overwhelming. But yes.
You know, personal stories are a great way to teach others and highlight to others why this is important. And our stories are not widely exposed. And so, you know, one of the beautiful things about tonight is people are getting to see the humanness of who you are, the passion upon which you've placed your focus, and the chat is just going wild. There's all kinds of beautiful comments going on there. I'm trying to read them and trying to listen at the same time. But I was thinking about holding space and holding or having an opportunity to have a voice about our own personal identities and where to place that. And what I have experienced a lot of times is allies want to speak for us, and somehow or another, in their good intentions, they've forgotten that we're still here, and that we know our own stories, and the way that we might present it and the way that you understand it may not be the same. And so however well-intended you are as an ally, you have again used your privilege and power for self-gain rather than benefiting the greater good. So, and this is just one example of how allies try to step forward and be help. And so one of the things I was taught is, if you are truly an ally and you're coming to, an event or a talk, don't take the front seats. Don't be the first to speak. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you speak. What advice would you give to allies who are well-intended but have made that faux pas, and now you're trying to, reclaim the platform that was intended for you? What would you do?
I'd
You're
like to
still
say
here.
something if I can.
Yeah.
I really think that for people that I've encountered who, like you said, are good, well-intentioned, they really want to be allies. I've noticed that they are tending to, try to dictate to the Black community when and how we should confront anti-Black racism, and if it's not moving at a pace that they think is appropriate as allies, it's insufficient. And, it's upsetting, because it's like you are coming to this discussion and this conversation about anti-Blackness really as an outsider. So you don't even know what it's like to live in, Blackness, to confront these microaggressions and sometimes really blatant, attacks against your identity and your personhood, to get to a point where you even feel comfortable confronting anti-Blackness. It can take a really long time for some people. It can be frightening. So, to hear allies say things like, or these supposed allies say things like, well, you should be doing something now, and this is a problem and we should attack the situation, and let's march in there and demand justice for you. It's like, who is this really for? Is this really for me? Or is this, to like boost your own ego so that you feel like you're doing something for the greater good, as you said, Kim?
Right. I hear what you're saying there. And I do think that it takes a lot of work, to even open this dialogue, let alone try and coach and encourage allyship that is truly meaningful and beneficial to those who are being impacted. But I don't believe that confrontation is the best way. I know a lot of people believe in confrontation and, having marches and putting themselves in the line of harm. Can you share some other ways that we could do this? That for those that maybe don't have that courage to stand up but still want to be able to do something, whether internally or externally. So when I say internally, I'm talking about, Blackness as a whole and allies, which for the most part, and we have allies from all colors. I mean, we have to be real about this, but in this instance, I guess we're talking about Blackness and whiteness, and we know that and I don't like to group people, like I don't like to do broad stroke like that, because I personally don't like being broad stroked, right? But just to ease the conversation through, how can we approach this in ways that maybe people never thought about as meaningful and actually moving you know, moving the need forward in an actual, tangible, meaningful way that we might not see right now. But in the long term, like a grain of sand on a beach of change, it does matter, right? Not everybody's willing to sit on a panel and talk about this. Not everybody's doing research on it. Not everybody in the immediate kind of experience of it can even think of the words to say sometimes. I know I've been in that situation many times where my mouth is just hanging open in shock. And why am I shocked? I have to live in this skin every day of my life. I don't get to leave it. And while I love my identity, I sometimes am at a loss of words or ideas. And I think hearing the three of you speak about ideas and approaches based on the commitments and research that you've done personally for the greater good is really inspirational. And you know, hearing what you have done is also really important. So perhaps you might have something to share in that regard. Molly, do you want to say something? Yes, join us, please.
I really like what Melissa was highlighting there, and to speak personally about how I'm trying to work through in practicing allyship is this balance of learning to use my voice even if it feels uncomfortable in spaces where you know, I'm with other parts of my community where it's really important that I use my voice, and not taking up space in spaces where other voices need to be highlighted, amplified, and giving their stories and experience and ideas and visions to the collective, or are leading the movement. And I think what I'm really working with is that allyship is really a receptive position, and connecting with a community or organization, like being able to connect with NACA for me has been such a beautiful relationship build, to take cues from them and their leadership, that I might be really receptive to where the movement needs to go, or where I can be an ally, and where you know, my voice isn't needed, and maybe I can be in the background, you know, trying to put wires together to support the stage where voices are being shared. So really trying to get that real sense of receptivity in my practice, and to continue to work through that on me. And when you were talking a little bit about, like, what are some ways in which we're different allies, all allies are going to be coming from different spaces and with different skill sets too, different privilege on the spectrum of power in that to transfer and to and so, like, I think as an ally, go within the spaces where you have strengths, that you can, like a library, say, here's some of the things that I have, you can use them if you need them. Like, some people are accountants, I'm so not like that, but if that, you know, to have the resources sort of like a library at the ready as an allyship resource, then communities can kind of be like, okay, I need this, and then you're responding to that call and movement and be like, okay, I'm ready.
You know, I think sometimes people are looking for an easy kind of McDonald's version of what allyship is. Okay, check the boxes, I'm an ally, and they're self-proclaiming and stepping forward and saying, but I'm on your side. And we know that allyship has lots of different maybe translations or explanations or definitions, and we opened, you know, with some ideas about that, and it was beautiful. I tried to you talk so fast, Beatrice, I couldn't write it all down. But, you talked about the embodiment of putting your mouth where your power is. And a lot of times people don't recognize that they have power, and they don't realize that they're utilizing power perhaps in harmful ways. And I think it would be useful in this dialogue to explore what that power is. When you're talking about power and privilege, there's the generalities. That if you have lighter skin, you're going to get some sort of a pass, or if you speak without a certain accent, of course, you're going to be seen as intelligent, and some of these superficial things. But there are other ways we could look at power and privilege. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing, Melissa, what you think power and privilege looks like, and how to transfer some of that. Like, how do we actually transfer that? It's not like we touch somebody and they magically, get inoculated or something. I think people really need a breakdown of what that transferring means, and who should be doing that.
There are people who have privilege, like you said, that's really beyond like the superficial, right? Where just being able to access particular spaces is a privilege. Being able to engage with particular networks is a privilege. Being able to have particular opportunities is a privilege, and not just economic opportunities, but just the opportunity to maybe be privy to a conversation, be privy to conversations between people. Like, for example, I know someone who wanted to start an organization, right? A nonprofit organization, but because they didn't necessarily know even how to do that. They had a great idea. They know they wanted to help the Black community, but they didn't have anyone to guide them as to who do you talk to? How do you write a grant? Where do you go to get a grant? These are the types of things that are beneficial when it comes to transferring power and privilege. So if you are somebody who you have access to people who write grants, you have access to, counselors to have their ear to even say, hey, I think this is something that is beneficial for my community. Not everybody has access to those people. So if you do have that, create opportunities and create the space for other groups of people to come in and be a part of the conversation, to talk about what could be beneficial to the community from their perspective. It tends to be, even talking through corrections and things like that. When we think about the type of programming that is available to prisoners in Canadian corrections, it's very linear, and it's like a one-size-fits-all model of correctional programming. But what Black prisoners are saying is that the programs that are being offered are not culturally, relevant, and they don't necessarily speak to my experiences as a Black man or Black woman, reintegrating or re-entering my community after being imprisoned, or even dealing with confrontation in my community as a Black person. So it brings me to now question who created that program? Who came up with that, that one-size-fits-all program, particularly when we're seeing that the demographic of prisoners is changing, that there is an overrepresentation of, Black people who are imprisoned. We have to now start to cater the programming to the lived experiences of this group of people, because they are going back out into the community, and the resources that they're being given are not necessarily going to fit with their environment. So if you have the opportunity to transfer the power that you have to create that program to somebody else, to maybe a community group that does work with the Black community, a community group who does work with, ex-offenders or their families already within the community, allow them to create a program to pass on to Corrections Service Canada, right? That is far more beneficial, like you're saying, I think, as opposed to just marching and things like that. That is, I guess, allyship in practice when you are using your power and the opportunities that you have and these very exclusive spaces to bring other people into the conversation who really do need to be there.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about a hand up rather than a handout, you know, and really embracing the idea that you may not even realize that you hold a level of privilege and that's your world. But you can recognize when you have a skill set that perhaps is transferable and could be beneficial. I know, Beatrice, you have something to say here, so feel free to add on to the conversation.
What actually came to my mind, well, when I think of power, it's the ability to influence other people, right? And then when I think of power, I think of the concept of intersectionality, right? Where we all have different intersections of our identity. So whether your religion, your class, your sexuality, your status in the workplace, like all of us in some capacity have a privilege premised on that, right? So I think that when we're looking at or talking about allyships, we need to understand that our positions within the relations of power is unequal, right? And I think it's important that we use our positions to leverage this power, right? So let's say you're in a space of racialized women who are seeking some sort of resource, but there's a hard time communicating, right? So if you're someone who speaks that dominant language, you can mobilize that power you have, you can mobilize that privilege you have, even though you're racialized, to provide a resource for someone.
Yeah.
And that's how I think of allyship. And that's how I think of power. And that's how I think of mobilizing or utilizing that privilege that you have, right? Even though you are racialized or you are not of the dominant group or so forth, but we all in some capacity have power.
I love that you kind of broad swept everybody so that we could all recognize that we have power. And it's how you go about utilizing, and you might not even call it power, right? Maybe it's ability, or maybe it's a gift, or maybe it's a passion, but those are all forms of power in some ways. And we probably have a broad spectrum of attendees who are watching this, and they're just nothing but accolades in the chat here for each one of you and your comments and the clarification that people have received. But for those who are watching, they have power within their own circles. So they're going to have takeaways from this. If there was one takeaway, or, you know, a collection of takeaways that you really wanted people to remember about this conversation, like what do you really want people to learn from this conversation, take away, and perhaps generate even further dialogues outside of here, and maybe an action as well? I'm going to ask each one of you to give a response on that in terms of, you know, what action and what you really want them to remember. So I'm going to start with you, Melissa.
Something that I would love people to, you know, recognize and appreciate is that as Black people, we're very aware of racism when we see it and when we experience it. And, you know, if we're expressing to you that something that someone did was racist, you know, to dismiss that as, you know, maybe us misinterpreting or overthinking the interaction is very offensive, you know, at least for me, I find it to be very offensive because I know what it looks like, you know, I can feel it, I can see it, I can hear it because I've lived it. So I would like people to just appreciate that when someone is saying to you, like a Black person is saying to you, you know, this happened to me, it was really racist, or it was grounded in racism, that we don't dismiss that we don't dismiss that experience and, you know, treat it very nonchalantly or try to sweep it under the rug. Because that's what, you know, especially for myself, that's what I've been living with my entire life. So if I am now getting to a place where I'm speaking it and I'm saying, this is what I'm going through, I would like to feel supported. I don't want it to continue to be dismissed and continue to be brushed aside or being told that, you know, I'm being misunderstood, as opposed to confronting it for what it is.
forgetting to unmute here. My dogs are grumbling in the background, so I'm trying not to have too much background noise. But I hear you. I think, you know, to manifest real change, you need to be heard and you need to be validated, and it needs to be accepted as a truth, right? And you shouldn't have to explain that to somebody. They should just be able to accept that. And that's, you know, this is how we put momentum in change. Instead of constantly backtracking by being challenged and having to defend your truth, it doesn't really benefit in the long term, right? It's constant work being placed on our lap that is like running a gerbil's wheel. You're just going around and around and around, but you're not spiraling up and outward. And that's really what we need to do. So I thank you so much for offering that to all of the listeners that have joined us tonight. Molly, do you want to weigh in on that? What's one thing you want people to do? Like, give them a challenge, and one thing you really, or a couple things that you really want them to remember about tonight's dialogue.
So many good points, like things racing through my head. I think one important thing that I think would be a great takeaway is the idea that allies, you don't claim yourself an ally so much as you try and practice allyship and try and receive from the communities that you're in solidarity with, you know, whether that in that feedback, whether that was acting as an ally or not, and that's a continual dynamic process that doesn't end. That's not a space of arrival. And it's not a place of, it needs to be a place in which you can not be afraid to mess up, and then turn off, but that it's a place of continual renewal and relearning. And so I think maybe an action in that is I would say that anyone who's listening, to find places to speak with others who are wanting to practice allyship, about some of the things that stir in you as you do that internal work, to have some camaraderie around that and deconstruction at that level, to have some support in that, to find someone to do that with, and then come into relationship with other communities together, to act together, as you're continually sort of debriefing what it is to understand your privilege, and understand how to move to a different place. And a lot about this, the Blackness and whiteness as constructs, and more working through some of those ideas of how we have to deal in those constructs, because they are realities in terms of how they are, people are treated differently in our society, and how power is delineated. But also so much was brought up tonight about how do we then deal with those constructs and our identities, and find new identities also, as we are as allies and as people together, trying to make something new where people can thrive. Yeah.
Oh, can't we just all get along? That's a phrase that we've heard over and over, and yet it hasn't happened. And why hasn't it happened? I feel like we're in 2022, and we have this very vocal and powerful youth force who's like challenging and asking questions and demanding things, and exposing injustice in lots of different ways. And I hear you. I hear what you're saying, Molly, and I think that it's good advice for the listeners. And I know, Beatrice, you probably have some very succinct and dynamic words to kind of offer people to remember from this talk. I mean, there was lots of ground covered here, and I think people should always leave with an actionable item. I think they should be challenged a little bit. You don't just get to have all this dessert and then just walk away from and say, well, that was nice. Give people something to do, challenge them with one action at least that they could do, or someplace they could go, or something they could align themselves with. And also, what do you want them to remember? What's the most important thing that you think they should remember from tonight's dialogue?
So I'm kind of derailing a little bit. And I haven't spoken about this at all, and none of us have spoken about this, but I think that I kind of want to note that Black people don't always have to be in a mode of resistance. Like, I think that even in the project and the work that I do, when I was interviewing Black folks, they were just like really, really tired, right? And really like exhausted. And I think it's important to note that, like, for Black people and Blackness, we exist beyond always resisting the state. We don't always have to be in resistance. Like, resistance is a dominant expectation we have of Black culture and of Black people. And we're always fighting. Like, we're constantly fighting. And like, I'm not saying this to deny the terribleness that we have in the world, nor anti-Blackness and how it's always perpetuating, but to draw our attention to recognizing that we're human beings, right? We're vulnerable people. We're beings that have other capacities too, right? We have desires, we have ambitions, we have hungers, we have fears, right? So like, oftentimes this construction of Blackness is so overwhelming that we're like always in the state of resistance, right? And like, I was thinking about this question, and I thought about enslavement, right? So during enslavement, Black women's work and their lives were not always entirely shaped by being enslaved, right? So Black women and Black men grew gardens, right? They decorated their homes, they organized parties in the woods, right? And drawing attention to this example is to help us paint a broader picture of humanity, right? Like, Black folks, we do not always have to participate in this dominant framework of perpetual resistance. Yes, we resist, but we do other things too. And I think one of the benefits of allyship, this is where allyship slips in, is letting our network sometimes take the lead, right? Like, allies, like in your activism, and particularly I'm speaking to white folks, I think that you must listen to place in the foreground your work, the lived experiences of Black folks and people of color, right? I believe that all allies should amplify productive rage for non-white folks in hopes of manifesting a freer world. But I think that Black folks, sometimes we could just breathe, chill out, do something else, and not always be in combat to the state. So that's what I got.
Yeah, that great, almost intergenerational fatigue of being in that combat state, as you framed it, is such a powerful truth. And it is exhausting. It's like, there are other aspects of me, I'm a human being living a life as well. And it takes a chunk of our lives as melanated people, whether we want it or not. It's going to come and insert itself into our lives, and then we're put in a position of, now what are we going to do about it? What are we going to say about it? How are we going to react to this? What are we going to champion? What history do we know? What words? Can this person actually hear me? Am I safe? And it just goes on and on and on. And you can see how the labor of it can cause fatigue and exhaustion, but that should never be misinterpreted as lack of interest in wanting real change for who we are as community members. And I know that we've been talking, I cannot believe that we're already at 8:34 and we only go until 9 o'clock tonight, and that we've had such a depth of conversation. And this is the opportunity now for the listeners to weigh in and ask questions. And there's a Q&A button that you can filter your questions through. And I took a quick look, and there's only 3 questions there, and all of them have been answered to date. And then there's the chat, and there's just so much going on in the chat here. I'm not going to scroll back, but perhaps my encouragement would be, if you are in the chat, to put question as the first word, and I'll just continue to scroll down from where we're at and ask those questions. There are endless questions that we can ask in terms of this dialogue, right? Black History Month has been a great opportunity to highlight voices of color in lots of different ways, and multi-pronging it, right? Maybe it's through the arts, maybe it's through politics, maybe it's through activism, maybe it's this, that, and the next thing. However it's approached, you know, it shows the great diversity of who we are and all the ways that we can do that. But it shouldn't just end in February, and it shouldn't just be highlighted in February, right? This is like I mean, we don't get to walk away from this on a daily basis, and we're not, and we shouldn't always have to carry the line for being the experts, the go-to person. Are there any recommended places that you might want to offer that people could access perhaps virtually? You know, like, are there good sites to go to just maybe have entry points to, I don't know, allyship and Black voice? And I know it's a really broad question. I'm trying to narrow it down, but I'm trying to think how to do that. But, you know, when people do research, a lot of times the insertion of those who think they know about us take precedence over the actual authentic voice connection. And that's really disturbing in lots of ways. And it's also inaccurate because if you're truly looking for an answer, like, how do you vet the authenticity of the person who's offering that advice or offering that guidance? So in Newmarket, we have the great privilege of the Newmarket African Caribbean Canadian Association, and the acronym is NACA for that. And they do a tremendous job. But at the end of the day, they're a small group of people, and how much space can they hold themselves, and how much work are they willing to undertake when they have a full-time job and they have families and they're living their life on top of it all? Do you think organizations is the best way to go to try and seek authentic voice, is going to recognize Black organizations? And is there some sort of a listing of that online that people can access, or am I just right off in left field here? Anybody?
I'd have to circle back on that. I'm sure I can find them online and send them over, but I can't think of anything on the top of my head right now.
Okay, that would be wonderful.
Did you want to go, Molly?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to highlight that NACA has been building a really beautiful library of Black authors, novelists, you know, poets, and essayists, and, you know, biographies, and there's lots of books sort of that would inform allyship as well. And so within this community, that's something that can be accessed and then you know, used and absorbed and processed. That might be really wonderful for the people who are living around here.
Molly, do you happen to have that website handy for those who may not even know it? Do you happen to know, or can you place it in the chat, or somebody place it in the chat
website?
so that well, wherever this resource is placed?
So it's like a physical resource, but like the NACA website, or the NACA, like you can, I think it's chair at nacacommunity.ca, but I'll put it in the chat so you can, or maybe there's someone else more specific, but where you can access that library. I'm not exactly sure of that process, but yeah, we can. It's
placed in there by Holly. Thank you, Holly, for doing that.
Thanks, Holly.
Our listeners are really active, and we have a question that's directed at NACA in particular. And the question is there a specific need at present that the organization has? So it sounds like somebody's trying to find ways to connect with NACA, and I'm not sure, you know, the three of you are able to answer that. And I know that Teresa and Pauline are still online here, even though it's not directed at the panelists. Did you want to weigh in on that and perhaps offer a comment? And if so, please turn your camera on and unmute.
Hi, Charlene. Thank you for the question. I am going to suggest that you, 1 second here. I'm going to suggest that you send an email so that we can connect, if you will, off air, and I'll put my I think Molly in her promotion of the NACA library just called it out, chair@nacacommunity.ca. By the way, thank you for that, Molly. So yes, if you could send an email to, and I'll put it in the chat, and so we can connect, and I'll be able to have some discussions in terms of, you know, just where we are and where we need to be and how you can support that.
And perhaps some of the needs that that you currently have gaps in, because it sounds like this person is interested in trying to assist in that area. Thank you so much, Teresa, for joining us and letting us have an answer to that. Now, there are still no questions coming in from the listeners.
Is it all right, Kim, if I just give a suggestion for resources?
I love it. Please do.
I'm mentioning this and I'm not mentioning it. Well, I'm going to say that I know everybody is not an academic, right? And sometimes academic material is, you know, a bit like dry, I guess. But, you know, from my own experience as someone, you know, coming into academia and having access to like journals and articles written by other scholars, it's really helped to give me real world examples of the impact and significance of anti-Blackness within Canada. And these are things that I didn't have access to, or I didn't even know about as a non-academic. And once I did become aware of them, I really started to feel like these are reports that everybody really should kind of look into and have access to. So when it comes to criminal justice, if you are curious as to what the experiences are of Black people in the criminal justice system, in federal prisons, you can just go to the Office of the Correctional Investigator website. So the Office of the Correctional Investigator oversees conditions in federal prisons, and every single year, Ivan Zinger, who's our current correctional investigator, puts out a report of what's been happening in corrections, the impact on Indigenous populations, Black populations, what conditions of confinement look like. It's just a really brief overview of what's happened in the past year. He gives a lot of data and statistics that's also always very helpful to me to kind of put everything into perspective. Also for individuals who may be curious about like racism or anti-Blackness in housing, there's an excellent report that was put out by a U of T professor by the name of David Holchansky, and I'll put his name in the chat. And he really looks at how Toronto has changed over the past 30 years, highlighting how it's become like a racially segregated city in 30 years. And the maps, again, really put everything into perspective. And I think I know this has helped me for when you have an understanding of what anti-Blackness looks like in the city, but then to see it on a map and to see how, you know, the city has changed over time, it just makes it a bit more real. So for people who, you know, maybe want to understand the experience a bit better beyond storytelling, I find that having the data to show the numbers, to show how many people or who is being impacted by, you know, systemic discrimination and racism in our city, in the GTA, the reports can be very helpful. You can also go to like Google Scholar. You can type in basically anything that you're interested in knowing about, and somebody probably would have written about it. You can just skim through those. Like I said, academic writing could be very dry, but also very helpful.
Thank you so much for that, Melissa. So there is a question, and this question, I'm going to join it with another question that came in the chat. And this question was, do you have an ally that had an impact on your life, and how? And then in the chat, there was somebody wanted Molly to talk about, oh my gosh, there's so much going on here. How Molly, talk about what influenced her move to become an ally. So I think all of you can come at it at your own individual perspectives. But is there one person perhaps who was a memorable ally or a continuous ally to this date that you want to talk about and share how that came to be and why, why that was meaningful to you. And Beatrice, you haven't spoken in a while, so I'm going to go to you first. Do you have somebody in mind, or do you want me to go to somebody else?
I'm trying to think. An ally.
Don't have to name names, just,
when and we're conceptualizing allies in terms of someone from the dominant group, or an ally in terms of anyone could be an ally.
I think you can take it from and frame it in whatever perspective you want. I think that allies are so diverse, and
Yeah.
I think we've only thought about allies in terms of color, but it goes beyond color, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would say teachers for me, honestly. I think when I was in elementary school, I had really poor experiences with racist teachers that really, I don't know, I would say created a feeling of like being inferior, right? I hated going to school. I had really poor experiences. So getting in touch or having teachers, a particular teacher reach out to me and support me throughout my experience really changed the trajectory of my life, right? I didn't think that I would be able to go to post-secondary school or anything of that capacity. So I think that she literally shifted, and I lied, I had two. So one was a Black lady, and another one, she was Eastern European. And I actually still carry the note she wrote to me before I left elementary school about pursuing my dream. So thanks for reminding me of that, actually. But yeah, I'd say teachers. Oh, you're muted.
Such a beautiful share, and obviously still emotionally triggering.
Yeah.
Thank you for that vulnerability and that share. We're coming close to a close, but Melissa, do you have a story to share in your own experience of somebody who has been a good ally and perhaps influential in your life, and why?
I think it's definitely, similar to Beatrice, like great teachers have really demonstrated to me that the experiences that I had in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, didn't correlate to my abilities as a person, and really helped to shift my understanding of what I was capable of. Because just like Beatrice, I was also told, like, Black people don't do well in university, you shouldn't go to university, just go to college and things like that, right? And I believed that, and I internalized those things, and I trusted them, and they weaponized, their privileged position as teachers in my life to really hold me back from, even pursuing academia. And then to see what I'm accomplishing now and what I have accomplished, like, it really goes to show how harmful these types of, teachers can be to the experience of racialized students and the abilities of racialized students. So I would say, like, really, really great teachers who are supportive, who believe in you, who give you the opportunity to know about scholarships and opportunities, and who give you the opportunity to present at conferences and join them to write papers and just get your voice out there, are rare and so necessary to have been so necessary to my success, I guess, my academic success, and my just reigniting the passion for education for me.
Thank you so much for that. It's interesting as you tell your stories. I guess you're not used to telling that part of your stories. Both of you definitely demonstrated an emotional tie to that experience. And I wonder sometimes if teachers realize how powerful they are, because I too never thought I belonged in university. I thought that was an upper echelon that was for people of no color and great wealth. And I've come to learn otherwise. I've been to college twice and university once, and you choose where you're going to belong. But Molly, there's a specific question for you about what influenced you to become an ally, and only have about a minute if you don't mind, but do your best so we can stretch it to 2. But share your story.
I'll try and be super brief thought. I think two things. One is I think growing up, I grew up in a co-op, and my parents were really committed to equity work and community work. And my village of people who supported me growing up, helped raise me, were also very well diverse, but also really equity minded and community minded, always sort of intersectionally working together for each other's rights and abilities to move within society. And so that speaks a lot to me, to creating climates that foster that in educational spaces and in our families, and in all the places that children are being raised up, and as we're learning from them too. And the other one is just sort of more conceptual, is that I have, since I've been a little kid, I've been really connected to our interconnection as people. And the more I understood how my identity, constructed identity of whiteness is part of the fracturing and separation between peoples, the more I wanted that sense of repair and equity. And I feel very much that my wholeness in my humanness really is dependent on all of our wholeness and humanness and ability to, we are all whole and human, ability to play out that humanness with ease and in thriving ways in our society. And I think I continue to want to do that work within myself and outwardly, and recognize each other's deep humanity and celebrate it together, our differences and the ways in which we're our experiences interweave, and to really be in solidarity with each other's struggle and with each other's beauty. And I want to continue to do that. And I feel so honored to be part of this panel tonight. And I've learned so much from both you and Beatrice and Melissa and you, Kim. And so thank you so much for allowing me to be part of it.
Oh, you're so very welcome. Any other final words from the panelists? Any final things you want to, maybe you're like, oh, I forgot to say this, and this is your opportunity. You can say it now. Beatrice?
I don't have anything to say, but there's a question that I thought was interesting. I don't know if we have time for it.
Let's try.
But Morris asked, does it matter what identity you choose if society sees you as Black? And I think that's in relation to your comment, Melissa. And I think that's super interesting because, like you said, when African folks or people from the diaspora come to the West, they're superimposed with this construction of being Black, right? But does it matter how you choose to identify if you're always constructed and in relation to this construction of Blackness? Right, like I think that's interesting. But
I missed that question. Thank you so much for bringing it up. I was going to do it, and then I got caught up in just the remarkable responses and heartfelt responses. You know, it takes a great deal of courage to step forward and hold your space and share your voice. Is there any last comments, Melissa? Any final things you want to offer before we wrap this up and bring it to a close?
I'm just appreciative, really, of the space and the opportunity to just have these types of conversations. And like you said, you know, hopefully to extend them beyond the month of February, you know, and just have repeated dialogue about the impact of anti-Blackness, and to work together to come up with strategies to combat that within our various, you know, communities and Canadian society as a whole. Nothing is going to change if we don't talk about it, but talking about it can't be the end of the work.
This is so true. Right? This is so true. Momentum is not achieved by just talking. You have to actually do. So what can you do? And I hope you've heard lots of ideas tonight on what you can do. You know, I want to thank, and I don't want to mess this up, so I'm going to actually read what I wrote to thank you. I want to thank each one of you for your informative sharing and commitment to make the world we live in better, safer, and more just. It's been such a privilege to witness excellence in thoughts and actions. And I personally really want to encourage you to shine. We need you. Change makers choose those spaces, and sometimes they're pushed into those spaces, but they are so important in the rewriting and the authentic voice telling of our stories. And they're so diverse, and we got to experience great diversity tonight at a level of excellence that I didn't know what to expect, but that I feel so privileged to have been a part of. It's actually the time when we have to bring this to a close, and I think it could go on, and it looks like you're all warmed up now, ladies, and you're ready to keep it going, but we have to slow it down now and bring it to a close. And with that close, there are some really sincere thanks that we need to offer, because this would not be possible without a great team behind the scenes, and teamwork always makes the dream work. And I love that phrase, and I use it a lot, and I really mean it when I say it. So I'd like to thank the organizers. So the town of Newmarket, Newmarket Public Library, East Gwillimbury Public Library, and of course the Newmarket African Caribbean Canadian Association for making this event and many more throughout the month of February a valuable contribution to York Region's recognition of Black History Month. Remember that you are a change maker. Do what you can, always in always. And I want to wish everyone a very good night. Be well, be safe, and I can't wait for our paths to intersect again. Thank you to each one of the panelists as well. Your contributions are invaluable. Take good care. Good night, everybody.